Thưa quý vị và các bạn, Vietnam's Lingering Ghost Facing the Legacy of Agent Orange, tiếng Việt tạm dịch là đối mặt với di sản da cam, bóng ma vương vất ở Việt Nam, là một phóng sự tài liệu trong series các phóng sự về các cuộc chiến tranh trên thế giới của công ty truyền thông HDNet của Mỹ.
Để thực hiện được bộ phim này, phóng viên Greg Dobb đã tới Việt Nam để gặp gỡ hàng trăm người tại nhiều vùng miền khác nhau, đặc biệt là các em bé sinh ra sau chiến tranh bị các dị tật bẩm sinh, các bệnh nan y như là thần kinh, ung thư, di chứng của chất độc da cam.
Và kính thưa quý vị, phóng sự điều tra mang lại nhiều khám phá mới, kể cả sự việc chính phủ Mỹ cuối cùng cũng phải nhận trách nhiệm về những thiệt hại mà người Mỹ đã gây ra trong cuộc chiến tranh tại Việt Nam.
Vietnam today. There is a ghost here that you won't immediately see, the last lingering ghost from the war. You won't hear it above the hum of this nation's budding prosperity. You won't spot it in the faces of the people you find on the streets and rice paddies of this country. In fact, from the day we landed here, I was welcomed warmly by everyone I met, including total strangers like these who teased me with a victory sign at a local marketplace. But there is the ghost, the one cruel curse that Vietnam says the U.S. left behind. You won't see it until you come to a place like this and learn the sad story behind the deformities of this young Vietnamese man born 10 years after the war was over, Nguyen Duc Duan. Duan's father, Day, blames his son's birth defects on what happened during the war when American planes flew overhead and sprayed something from the sky.
I saw many airplanes flying. The airplanes flying low. There was something misting from them all over the area. I just thought the airplanes were pretty. I watched them, but I didn't think it was bad chemicals coming from the airplane.
Do you believe because you were sprayed, this happened to your son?
I think I was affected by the chemical. I think that because I am like this. Because I was affected by the toxins. That is why my son is like this.
It's also hard to believe there was a war here until you meet this 28-year-old man, also born after the war was over, named Nguyen Ngoc Phuong, who is not quite 3 feet 3 inches tall.
Previously, my dad used to be in the Army, and he was affected by Agent Orange, and when I was born, I was like this. There are 2 of us in our family who are like this. In our house, my mom and dad gave birth to 6 children. Me and 1 younger sister have got defective legs. She is also as small as me.
And all these years after the war, they blame it on Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a herbicide we sprayed during the war, named for the color-coded barrels in which it was stored. American aircraft dropped more than 20 million gallons of herbicides, mostly Agent Orange, over large portions of the jungle, in concentrations up to 50 times what the manufacturers suggested to kill plants. In some provinces, people here remember, half the land was stripped bare. But that was the purpose, to defoliate the trees and make it easier to see the enemy sneaking south, to deprive him of his sanctuary. The trouble is, some science and statistics suggest it wasn't just bad for the trees. Plenty of people breathed it. Others ate and drank from sources contaminated by it. The issue and the challenge for the U.S. and Vietnam is it might still be contaminating people here to this day. Agent Orange has been called the last lingering ghost of the war.
The Vietnamese were purposefully targeted by Agent Orange. The American soldiers were either spraying the Agent Orange or came into that area afterwards, and as a result, the Vietnamese are the ones most affected by it.
Dr. Nguyen Trong Nhan is a former Minister of Health in Vietnam and former president of the Vietnamese Red Cross. It's not as if he's a strident critic of all things American. He proudly displays a photograph of a meeting he once had with President Clinton and earnestly keeps a miniature Statue of Liberty close to his desk. What does this mean to you?
I respect American people because American people respect the freedom and to have a life happiness.
But Dr. Nan wants the United States to own up to the unhappiness that his government says we created with Agent Orange.
It has harmful effects on the environment and human health. That is a reality. That's a crime that has happened in Vietnam.
The United States, when it was spraying, says they did not know it would hurt human beings. They just did it to get rid of the jungle.
Now, for the people that have committed that crime, of course, it's very difficult to accept something that's your fault.
Strong language to use, but here's why. Because a byproduct of the chemicals mixed together to make the herbicide to kill the trees was dioxin. Now banned around the world because of the damage it does to the human body, dioxin is called one of the most toxic, deadly, and stubbornly resistant poisons known to man. There's no disagreement that the United States brought the toxic herbicide into this country, but still today, more than 35 years after the end of the war, there is major disagreement about what human harm it really caused and whether the U.S. should, as Vietnam demands, take responsibility. The Vietnamese say one fact is undeniable. In the nearly 50 years now since the United States first sprayed Agent Orange here, the population in parts of Vietnam where Agent Orange was used has been plagued by deformities, cancers, severe levels of retardation. And now, so long after the war, the same frightful afflictions today keep cropping up. How many victims do you believe there are?
We estimate that there are 3 million citizens. That is the estimate that we have relied on because it has been reaffirmed by an American university.
Actually, the American research done by Columbia University for the U.S. government's own Institute of Medicine says that some 3,000 Vietnamese villages were sprayed, which could affect between 2 and 4 million people. However many there really are, the casualties Vietnam blames on Agent Orange are not just confined to small corners of the country. We traveled to urban and rural sites, north and south, to see the people who still believe they are fighting the last battle of the war. The therapeutic centers we visited are a living demonstration of that fight. They are for children with mental or physical birth defects that Vietnam attributes to Agent Orange. This is Long Hu Ni, in English, Friendship Village near Hanoi. It was established only about a decade ago by an American veteran of the war. There are 120 kids here now with all manner of disabilities, physical and mental. They come from parts of Vietnam where Agent Orange was sprayed decades before they were even born. Then there's this center in Da Nang, established by a group called DAVA, the Da Nang Association for Victims of Agent Orange. It's very close to a former U.S. air base, now a commercial airport, where Agent Orange was stored and mixed and loaded onto aircraft. And it's where we met Win Ngoc Phuong, the diminutive man with the deformed chest.
My body is compacted. It pushes against my heart and it's hard to breathe. At night, when I sleep, if I lean back, it presses against my lungs. So when I sleep, I have to sleep face down. If I lie on my back, I can't breathe.
We also wanted to get a sense of the Agent Orange issue outside the cities, so we came here to the rural province of Quang Nai. Today it seems pastoral if impoverished, but back when the war was fought, Quang Nai was a haven for the enemy, for Viet Cong soldiers, and therefore one of the most heavily sprayed parts of the country. Vietnam classifies 15,000 people in this province alone as victims of Agent Orange, today victims of a grave genetic inheritance. We met young people here who might have been affected two ways: the Agent Orange that the U.S. unloaded on their parents, who could have directly inhaled it when they were fighting for the enemy, or the Agent Orange that was unloaded on their land. This is 13-year-old La Ti Chi. Chi's house is deep in the countryside, and she has rarely ever left it. Her father works far away to send money home. Her mother, Vo Ti Tom, has always had her hands full doing everything for a girl who could do absolutely nothing for herself. What kinds of things do you do each day to help Chi get through the day?
When I wake up, I cook for her and I feed her. And then I go to work in the garden, and then at noon I cook and feed her lunch. And then when she needs to go to the toilet, she tells me.
So Chi needs help for everything she does. Is that right?
And the mom helps all the time.
Chi's disability appears to be cerebral palsy, severe cerebral palsy. Nguyen Mon Hung runs a program that helps people in rural Vietnam like Chi. Is there any way, do you know if there's any way to say it is because of dioxin?
This case, we think that may be a case of dioxin because number one, she was born in a hotspot place where, Agent Orange was sprayed during the war. Number two, her father and her mother joined the army in this area and also in some other highland area where were also sprayed.
It's a similar story, although a different disability, at the rural home of Nguyen Duc Duan.
A long time ago, when I was small and went to school, my foot was deformed, and it was bent up like this, so I couldn't walk. My mom and dad would have to carry me to school, and my foot had an open sore, and it smelled really badly.
Duan's legs are not his only affliction. He also has no control of his bladder. And I think you also told me that there's a problem in your backbone, at the bottom of your backbone. Tell me about that.
The cancer is in my spine. It's in this bottom section. It's affected the nerves, so when I touch my skin, I can't feel anything there.
Crippled legs, a dysfunctional bladder, and cancer. The odds of all turning up in the same ill-fated young man would, to a layman's eyes, at least seem low, but for the use of dioxin around the land where he now lives. While the U.S. might argue there is no credible connection, it leads people here to only one conclusion. What does he think caused this?
I was born like this. I hadn't thought about why I was like this. I just knew that I had to accept it. It wasn't until I went to have it examined and treated that the doctor said it was because of the toxins.
The question is, why can't the Vietnamese prove every case of disability and disease that they blame on Agent Orange? Dr. Lê Kê Son used to run Office 33, Vietnam's counterpart to the U.S.'s Environmental Protection Agency.
We cannot take blood, means, and other from many people to analyze dioxin because the price of analyzing dioxin very, very expensive.
The price is very high.
Very high. I think so. For each sample, blood sample, we should pay about 800 to 1,000 US dollar, and we should
per person.
Per sample.
For one sample.
Sample. And we should send the most sample to abroad for analyzing dioxin. And I think we have not enough money to do it.
Not enough money, because if Vietnam's estimate is accurate, it would cost up to $3 billion, money Vietnam doesn't have. But Dr. Son's agency did study the country's so-called hotspots, the specifically identified places in Vietnam where Agent Orange was concentrated.
And the dioxin, what we found in hotspot, so come from herbicide, especially Agent Orange. Yeah, and USA have caused these consequences.
Why should the U.S. government help Vietnam with Agent Orange now?
Many people say, not only me, when USA and Vietnamese do not solve good this issue, this problem, Agent Orange in Vietnam, the relation between Vietnam and U.S. cannot be really not normalization.
After meeting these poor kids at Friendship Village in Hanoi, and the young people we met in Da Nang, and in Quang Ngai, we thought we had seen a fairly full scope of those who the Vietnamese call victims of Agent Orange. We hadn't. This is the Hoa Binh Ward, which literally means the Peace Village, at Tu Zu Hospital in Ho Chi Minh City, the former Saigon. It is a place where children with grotesque deformities have been brought, and in some cases just dumped by parents who then disappeared. They cannot be cured. They can only be made more comfortable the way they are. Maybe. Like this 8-year-old girl. Or lots of girls and boys here with limbs that are warped, or partial, or not there at all. Dr. Win T. Ngoc Phuong got interested in the Agent Orange issue years ago when she found herself delivering babies with severe birth defects, yet even she doesn't claim that they're all indisputably deformed from dioxin. But, now you know, Americans who watch our program, they will see this young man and they will say, well, people are born in my country also who are missing limbs and have birth defects and deformities.
Yeah. Well, according to our study here, 64% of the deformed children here, the handicapped children here, have their parents exposed to Agent Orange during the wartime.
In other words, there are inordinate numbers of kids here whose parents were exposed to Agent Orange. The fact is, it is hard to see these children without at least wondering, could the Agent Orange be the source of their suffering? During our day at the hospital, though, it seemed clear to us that the officials taking us around wanted to hammer home the fact that a lot of pregnancies here end badly, even grotesquely, especially when they showed us into this room full of prematurely born or stillborn or aborted fetuses that they have preserved for people to see. They don't say these are all the result of Agent Orange, but with labels dating back decades, the message could not be more blunt, that Agent Orange has been the cause. Yet they really don't have to take you into this horrific room to make their point, because the young living patients here make it well enough, and they could just use this 6-year-old as their poster child. When we walked in, the child was loosely tied to a crib, punching the right eye socket as if there is permanent pain inside, with a right hand that has no functional fingers. Later in the day, this child with no eyes was back at her own crib when we came back with Dr. Phuong.
It is one of the deformities that I think caused by Agent Orange dioxin. It's too thin, skinny.
What is the best thing the United States government can do right now?
Recognize the legacy of Agent Orange in Vietnam. In the street areas, there are still many deformed babies born, maybe due to the Agent Orange effects, dioxin effects, and they are deformed, like this one. They have a life, you see. We cannot help him. We cannot help. We cannot do anything for him, you see. Nothing. This one, I cannot do anything for him.
For this poor child, little can be done. But what about others from this generation or even the next? Will the United States be more engaged than it's been? Will the United States accept the responsibility that Vietnam argues it should accept for problems that may or may not be the consequence of Agent Orange? The Vietnamese in their daily lives have certainly gotten past the Vietnam War, which they call, by the way, the American War. But there are still signs that they haven't fully forgiven the nation that was their mortal enemy. This is the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. It used to be called the Museum of American War Crimes. Outside, displays of American aircraft and tanks left behind when the U.S. bailed out. But inside, there is a big, prominent display dedicated to Agent Orange. There are lots of photographs of people with disabilities and deformities they blame on the herbicide, as well as photos showing how the U.S. used it. But you don't have to come to this museum to find out what Vietnam deems the dreadful, enduring effects of dioxin.
You can't read a newspaper in Vietnam over the course of 3 or 4 days without seeing at least one article on Agent Orange.
In Hanoi, we met the American ambassador to Vietnam, Michael Mahalik. He acknowledges that Agent Orange is a lingering ghost from the war. There are Vietnamese, including people in government, who say the United States is not doing nearly enough when it comes to Agent Orange, its impact on the environment, its impact on human life. When they present you with that argument, what do you say?
Well, I simply talk to them about the fact that we've been working with the government for a long time on this issue. It's an issue that is very sensitive. It's an issue that needs to be addressed by both sides.
I'm going to interrupt. Why is it sensitive? It was the United States that brought Agent Orange to this country. It was the United States that sprayed it in this country. So why is it
Well,
sensitive?
there are many people who have some very emotional views on this, and as a diplomat and as an American who did not participate in the war, I try to keep the emotion out of it. And so people immediately start getting emotional and saying, you have to do this and you have to do that. And what I say is, you know, let's take a look at the facts. Let's try and find out exactly what it is we're talking about here, and then let's see what is the best way forward for both of our countries.
What the U.S. wants to know is, can anyone say for sure that these unlucky young Vietnamese, so many years after the war, are victims of Agent Orange? Since there could be many causes of disabilities and diseases like these, what the U.S. wants is proof.
We still don't have accurate scientific data about exactly what the health effects are of dioxin and how it affects things and what the causes are. So let's make sure that we know exactly what it is we're talking about here. And that's very difficult to do in this area where a lot of the science is still somewhat new.
Is someone naive or ill-informed if they say, look, it's obvious, people who live in these regions that were contaminated where the Agent Orange was used suffer a higher rate of disabilities and deformities and so forth, cancers?
Well, you know, I don't want to classify people as naive or not, but I mean, it's kind of a too easy connection, let's put it that way.
And it's true. The connection is not incontestable. There are other possible explanations for many of the maladies we saw all over the country.
If you look at the environmental situation in Vietnam and some of the chemicals that are put into the water and into the air and into the soil here, I think that you can come very quickly to the conclusion that, well, maybe there's not just dioxin to worry about. There could be a lot of other things here. And again, with the healthcare system, prenatal care, postnatal care, very rudimentary here. And a lot of the villagers lead a very hard life, and so there are all kinds of potential causes for various types of illnesses or birth defects or disabilities. So, yeah, I would be very careful of drawing too quick a conclusion here.
But some Americans working on this issue of Agent Orange have not just drawn quick conclusions. We went to Washington to see Walter Isaacson, president of the Aspen Institute and co-chairman of a group called the U.S.-Vietnam Dialogue on Agent Orange Dioxin. When I interviewed the ambassador, his response was, we need more science. Do you feel like we need more science?
When you walk around Vietnam in the areas where it was sprayed, or even in areas nearby, you see a higher incidence of birth defects and cancers. And a lot of studies have shown that. You can't find the pure, exact numerical correlation, but in our hearts as well as in our minds, we know that this increased the number of birth defects and cancers.
Dr. Phuong from the hospital ward in Ho Chi Minh City is part of Isaacson's U.S.-Vietnam Dialogue group. You know, the United States government says there's not enough science.
Yeah.
You laugh.
Yes. Yeah.
Why do you laugh?
Because they know they have enough proofs that dioxin can cause many kinds of illnesses and defects. So that if they still say, no, not enough sciences, not enough scientific proof, it means a pretext to deny something.
There are some areas, though, where the science is not in dispute, where both sides agree on what the problem is and how it should be fixed. We are the first Western journalists ever allowed by Vietnam's government to see what was America's biggest air base up close. This is what you might call Ground Zero, Da Nang Air Base, from which American planes launched on their missions to defoliate the jungle. Now, the spraying may have taken its human toll, but there's also evidence of heavy concentrations that were and still are right here, because this is where, right on this site, where 55-gallon drums of Agent Orange were mixed and loaded, stored, and of course cleaned out after the missions. Over the years, between leaking barrels and wind and rain and natural runoff, tests show to this day some of that dioxin is still in local groundwater.
In the former air base, especially Da Nang, Bien Hoa, and Phu Cat, the level of dioxin are high and very high.
How high? A Canadian environmental firm tested the soil here, and the results were startling. They found dioxin levels at 300 to 400 times the international standard for what's considered acceptable. One scientist who took part said if these places existed in the United States, they would require, quote, immediate cleanup. One was this sickly plot of land where nothing productive ever grows. I don't know if there's contamination in this soil, but tests have shown that there is. And there's water all around us. Today's kind of a rainy day, and maybe some of it is runoff, but that's precisely the problem. So we'll turn the camera over here, and you will see there's water that goes into the field, and from the field, who knows where. When we left the tarmac at Ground Zero, our Army escorts led us to 2 locations nearby that demonstrate the insidious migration of Agent Orange, which infiltrates anything from soil to animal fat and stays for generations. When it rains, these must get higher and overflow.
When it is full, it overflows into the river and lake.
The other spot they took us on our tour around the edge of the airbase was Lotus Lake. The astonishing thing about Lotus Lake, the shocking thing, is that until only a couple of years ago, locals still came to fish here and took that potentially contaminated fish home for the evening meal. Now at least there's a guard tower manned by soldiers to warn people off if they still show up with a fishing pole or a net. And the United States, 35 years now after pulling out of Vietnam, can take some credit. Although the U.S. already gives aid to Vietnam, last year Washington finally dedicated dollars to directly target dioxin. It is a relatively small start, since the total cost of cleanup in Vietnam is put as high as $60 million, but still, the U.S. did appropriate $3 million, in part to help clean up the dioxin at the airbase. Also, thanks to the Ford Foundation and others, barriers have been built and cement caps installed to keep the dioxin from leaching further into the groundwater and food supply on which people depend. This is critical, because that Canadian study also showed that rainwater has carried dioxin into the drains of the city.
There's a lake there, and a lot of people were actually still fishing in the lake and whatnot. We've now kind of closed that off, and we're working closely with the government of Vietnam on the actual remediation. How do you get rid of the stuff that's in the soil?
Yeah, closing it off and cleaning it up are 2 different things.
Correct. But you got to do one first, and then you can get to the other.
But here in the neighborhood that abuts the airbase, that could come too late for people like Win T.Q., who has both deformed legs and a growing cancer in her blood. Like her parents and grandparents before her, this neighborhood, this house, are all she has ever known.
I was born here 38 years ago.
Were you born with your legs like that?
She said her legs like this and she falls down many times when she walks. The legs is very weak when she was born.
Why do you think you were born with these problems?
Basically, you can say it's because when I was born, I lived near the airport. The water was always dirty. We didn't have the money to clean it. For all this time, I've only been able to guess it was the water.
Now, Q's 10-year-old daughter Dong is the family's fourth generation to inhabit this simple house, not 1,000 feet down a narrow alley from the polluted old airbase, where so much Agent Orange went into the soil and into the water and stayed. In her belief, is America responsible for this?
The poison's causing this. I think you can say it was because the Americans were here. I think that's possible.
What could America do now?
I can let go of all the bad feelings. I just hope that you help people like me, victims like me. All of the people in Vietnam who are like me live a very hard life. And if you can please try to help reduce the suffering of victims like me.
Between her legs and now cancer in her blood, Q can no longer work at her old job sewing blankets and earning all of $10 a month. There may be little the United States can do to minimize her pain or her daughter's.
I don't know what the future of my daughter is going to be. I don't know how much longer I will be with her. I really regret what my illness will do to my daughter. Thank you for coming to visit me, but after this, if I am gone, then I humbly ask that you will please help my daughter. In truth, I don't know what else to say.
After our interview with Win T.Q., we asked her to show us the well at the back of her house, the well that until recently has been her sole source of water. On the way, she stopped in her rudimentary kitchen, and after filling a pot from the plastic jug of clean, safe water she's now been told she should use, she grabbed some greens that she was going to cook for herself and her daughter, and then she showed us out to the well, where she promptly used the well water, which might still be contaminated with dioxin, to wash the greens. Win T.Q. has never had tests to prove that dioxin is even the cause of her misery, but local officials consider her living proof of their main argument, that the closer you get to the wartime concentrations of Agent Orange, the greater the number of cases just like hers. Although a better word than proof might just be evidence.
I think it's clear that the United States is to blame for leaving that dioxin on the ground there. It's very hard to assess blame for each and every birth defect, say, or incidence of cancer, because even though we know there's an increased incidence of birth defects and cancers, we don't know which ones were caused by DDT, which ones were caused by dioxin that was left from the Agent Orange. And so instead of trying to sort all of that out, we said let's just clean it up and let's have programs that help those who have birth defects, cancers that may be caused by the Agent Orange.
Here's the other side of that coin. We lost the war. We didn't win in Vietnam.
Yeah.
We lost in Vietnam, so why should we clean up a mess when we lost the war?
Well, I think if you go to somebody's territory and you leave behind dioxin, Agent Orange, whatever it is, you have a responsibility to say, let's clean it up. We did that in our own country. Great chemical companies sometimes created things like Love Canal, and then they had to clean it up. We left behind these toxic chemicals in Vietnam, and it is symbolic of an improving relationship that we take joint responsibility for cleaning it up.
We certainly believe that Vietnam needs to get rid of dioxin. And yes, we put that dioxin there, so yes, I think that we want to help them get it out, and we're working on that.
But there is one thing that the U.S. probably will never do: actually take blame for whatever harm its actions might have caused. That's because while the government itself has long been considered immune from being sued for damages during war, it wants to insulate itself from any possible liability in the future. Meantime, there has been a lawsuit by Vietnamese citizens against the chemical companies that made Agent Orange until yesterday, when the Supreme Court handed them a defeat. But the ambassador argues legal liability isn't really the issue here anyway.
Is that a part of our reluctance, the possibility of lawsuits based on, let's say, a concession that, the United States, well, yes, this was our fault, so we're going to fix everything?
Well, I wouldn't doubt that that's in the back of the minds of many of the people back in Washington, but what we're trying to do here is get rid of a persistent organic pollutant, and we're trying to help people with disabilities regardless of cause.
So the American contribution might be a small amount, but it's a big step in a new direction because part of Washington's money is for what is specifically called humanitarian help. It circumvents questions about blame because it requires no proof that anyone is or isn't a victim of Agent Orange.
Has he had therapy before, or has he any surgeries?
And a piece of it landed here this past November in the form of these American doctors and physical therapists, all part of a new program in this American clinic at a hospital in Da Nang supported by U.S. aid money. The Americans spent a week here visiting the homes of the disabled.
She's making good eye contact.
And training their local counterparts on modern therapy.
But she's not strong enough. She's weak on the left. You, weak on the left.
Dr. Paul Wang is the leader of this American delegation from Vietnam Assistance for the Handicapped.
The physical therapists and rehab specialists here are technicians with very limited amount of expertise. As far as what the people and the disabled people here need, they need everything. Everything from wheelchairs to adaptive equipment, braces, prosthetics, or just simply access to care. One specific case that we saw today was the young boy. He had many of the necessary intrinsic reflexes to be walking, but for some reason he's not, and at this stage he should be walking, and even with the disability we think he could be walking if he had the access to care.
Also in Da Nang, we went to this clinic, largely supported from the United States with both private and government money. It provides help for everything from physical therapy to corrective surgery. This was its very first day of operation, and from the moment we got out of our car, as elsewhere, we saw people with all kinds of problems, although no proof that Agent Orange is at the root of their trouble, except that they all live close to the old air base. Mark Conroy runs the program for a foundation called East Meets West, one of 3 non-governmental organizations in partnership with U.S. aid to deliver humanitarian help in Vietnam.
Well, as you may know, the dioxin problem has been in Vietnam for a long time. It's been a hot political issue, and there's been very little scientific evidence to pinpoint exactly what disabilities may be related to dioxin contamination. So while we run the program, we can't make that differentiation. So we just choose anybody and everybody with disabilities to provide services to.
And that's okay with your funders?
Yes, that's fine.
Like USAID?
Like USAID.
Some of those people can lead productive lives. Nguyen Ngoc Phuong has figured out how to function in Vietnamese society. He works at fixing motorbikes, which are ubiquitous in this country, although, because of his afflictions, there are limits to just how much he can do.
My health is not as good as other people, so I work like other people, just as normal, but my productivity is not as high as normal people.
Finally, there's what we saw in Quang Nai province. Thanks to a local branch of East Meets West, Duan, whose mangled legs were amputated more than a year ago, has just gotten 2 prosthetic legs. And if ever you want to meet a young man who sees a future he couldn't see before, it is Nguyen Duc Duan.
Have you ever been able to stand before?
Before, I could not stand straight like this. Before, I never had this kind of balance.
How does it feel to be able to do this?
Now I feel more and more comfortable when I walk, when I stand.
Duan will go now to Ho Chi Minh City to earn a degree in electronics. And also thanks to East Meets West, and for just a few dollars a day, tutors and therapists have spent nearly a year now with Chi, the teen who shows severe symptoms of cerebral palsy. and now she not only has learned how she can put rice in a spoon and put it to her lips, but slowly, laboriously, and triumphantly, she can walk. This little journey of maybe 30 feet from the family table to the bed took Chi more than 5 minutes, but after a lifetime of total immobility, she did it herself. For many Americans, the humanitarian motive for helping people like this is motive enough, but for some, there's another good reason why helping Vietnam do what it cannot do alone will pay off in more ways than one.
Vietnam is definitely growing into a country that is going to be, I believe, a leader in Southeast Asia. They're very strategically placed geographically, economically, and just about every other sense of the word. I mean, everybody these days wants to be a friend of Vietnam. But we do have sort of a special relationship with Vietnam, and I want to see us make the most of it.
The relationship between the United States and Vietnam seems pretty good.
It's very high, I'd say.
Is this a sticking point in getting higher?
I think that it's an irritant. I do think it's an irritant. I think it's something that we do need to face and to deal with, and I think that we're beginning to do that right now.
Are you satisfied, as an American, as a member of the dialogue group, with the help we've given so far and the help that is at least so far on the horizon?
I'm very optimistic that people have begun to understand this problem, whether it's the Vietnam veterans, the U.S. Congress, the media. People have understood that this is just a pretty clean and clear moral issue, which is if you leave a mess, you ought to go back and clean it up when you possibly can.
Which the Vietnamese appreciate, although giving $3 million when the cleanup alone might require 60, to say nothing of humanitarian needs, that seems to some not nearly enough.
$3 million. And you know there are 3 million people. Vietnamese victims. If we did the math, and that $3 million helped all 3 million victims and did nothing else, then each Vietnamese victim would get only...
Everyone victim in Vietnam, only $1. You can eat only phở.
Noodle.
Một bát phở.
One noodle.
Một bát phở, một bát.
One bowl of noodle.
One bowl of noodle.
But as bad as things might be, until local citizens fully understand the potential dangers of dioxin, it is possible that yet another generation will grow up exposed to the poison and whatever pain it produces. The pain of a nation that believes many of its citizens are still suffering from a war that should have ended when the United States went home. Whether the new American involvement will lead to more money, and whether it will effectively bring an end to the lingering ghost of Agent Orange, is still an open question.